Everybody, welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about the Louisiana Purchase and mostly kind of about the history and kind of how it came to be. First, we have the history of it. So it's really important to mention how back in 1750, the United States did not yet exist. It was considered the New World, and it was claimed by three main powers: France, the British, and the Spanish. And they all kind of had their own little land. So you'll see in this map to your right, you see Spain mostly kind of had kind of the Latin America into Central America and into parts of North America. France mostly held areas such as, Canada and kind of the middle part. And then the British mostly had parts on the coast, New England, as you'd call it now. So these areas are really important. And what's really interesting to mention is how this will change a lot. None of this is set in stone, mainly because the French and Indian War of 1754 will later come, and a lot of things will change as a result. And it's really important to mention that as a result of all these things, these land masses will shift under different kind of powers. So unfortunately for them, for France, by 1762 this will then be ceded to the Spanish because of the French and Indian War. The French lost that war, and because of that, they ended up succeeding a lot of their Canadian land to the British, and a lot of their U.S. land, including the port of New Orleans, went to the Spanish. So the beginnings. So the United States saw the port of New Orleans in Mississippi as lucrative. So at this point, this is later on, of course, many years later. The United States is now a new nation. It needs the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River will help them be able to trade and will help them kind of more lucrative. And also New Orleans as a whole, because even this vast area wasn't really used. Like, most of this land was very uninhabited. The only inhabitants that really lived there were the Native Americans at the time. However, at this time, of course, the Spanish are now in charge of this. They now have this. Thanks to the French and Indian War, they now have control of this territory, this vast land. As a result, the United States gets in a treaty with Spain, and they now have the rights to use the Mississippi River. This does not mean they own Louisiana yet. This does not mean they own New Orleans. They are just allowed to have access to the river, which is for their convenience. So, how did it go back to France? Because we bought it from France, so it had to go back to them at some point. So in 1802, Spain succeeded the land back to France. And how did this happen? Well, it's also important to mention, at this time, this was after the French Revolution. Napoleon was now in power, and he was waging his Napoleonic Wars out in Europe. He needed money. But before we get there, one important aspect is when it came time, when he came to power, he was able to convince the Spanish to give him back that land, mainly because of another treaty involving Italy at the time. However, it's really important to mention that even though this is a treaty, it really wasn't a peaceful treaty. At the end of the day, Spain was kind of forced to. It was either Spain gives it back or Napoleon takes it back. So it wasn't much of a treaty. It was kind of forced. And at this point, after this had happened, the French didn't really have to honor the agreement that the Spanish and the U.S. had. They didn't have to allow the U.S. to use the Mississippi River. They didn't need to do that. And Napoleon most likely wasn't going to do that, But once again, the United States was only interested in the port of New Orleans, the Mississippi River, or possibly the West Florida parishes. And this is when they kind of came to, okay, we need to get this from France so we can have access to this land because they're not going to let us have access to it otherwise. So they purchased in 1803. So the United States saw an opportunity to purchase it. Jefferson sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to France to purchase New Orleans. Once again, it's important to mention how their intent was to either buy New Orleans or the river or just the parishes. They weren't looking for the entire territory. The entire territory. That wasn't really in their thought process. It's also important to mention that this is for $10 million. That's actually kind of cheap at this time. It will end up being $15 million for the entire territory. $10 million for one city at the time period, of course, wasn't a lot, but Napoleon needed money because, once again, he was waging his Napoleonic Wars. He needed money. He was in trouble. He had to deal a lot of issues with Haiti at this time. They had a revolution going on, and now Britain was getting involved in the mix with him in these Napoleonic Wars. So he was in trouble. He needed the money. Next, we're going to watch a little video.
Today, our map of America looks like this, but around 200 years ago, it looked more like this. How did this map change? To answer this question, first we have to look at the city of New Orleans, one of America's most culturally and historically rich destinations, according to their website. But New Orleans wasn't always part of the United States. Back in 1803, it was located in the southeastern corner of the Louisiana Territory, which was owned by France, and then later given to Spain, and then secretly given back to France in exchange for some land in Italy, and then officially given back to France 2 years later. New Orleans was an important city because it was a good trading location at the end of the Mississippi River. So, the U.S. wanted New Orleans, and newly elected President Thomas Jefferson sends two guys to negotiate with the French about purchasing the city. Jefferson's original instructions to the two men were to attempt to negotiate $10 million to buy either New Orleans, part of the Florida Territory, or at the very least secure access to the Mississippi River port. Now look at this from the French's perspective. Their plans to establish an empire in the Americas was failing. They feared a war with Britain.
So next we're going to go into the purchase itself. So of course Napoleon offered to sell the entire territory, not just part of it. And this of course got the U.S. kind of nervous because this was a big deal. You're basically doubling the size of the United States overnight. This was a big thing. But the good thing about this is this gave the United States the full access, so that they had full access not just to the river, but to the port city itself. And this was basically the history behind the Louisiana Purchase.